So how much of that time do you need to spend on prospecting versus all the other aspects of sales? And you can only do that if you work backwards from your goal. Overcompensate on the prospecting at the beginning, and then as I start getting engagement, I can begin to balance out. But I don't think that anybody has missed quota by having too many prospects. It's generally the other way around. You should be suspect of anybody, including me, who suggests that there is one method and that's the only method. I always have a laugh when I read articles that have in the title The Secrets of.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm your host, Will Barron, and welcome to another episode of the Salesman Podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, welcome to our new studio, the little setup that we've got over here. Hopefully it makes it a lot more interesting and just nicer to watch when you're consuming the content over YouTube. If you're listening to this on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of the Android podcasting apps, you can visit our YouTube channel over at salesman.red/YouTube. Come over, subscribe. Everything that goes out on audio only on the podcast front is also done in full video format, and there's extra video bits and pieces that go up there as well on top of the audio stuff. So if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, you are missing out for sure. On today's show, we have Tibor Shanto, and we're talking about prospecting from the perspective of being proactive with it. Of course, most salespeople hate prospecting. I am in that kind of group in that I do it because I know that once it's done, it's done. And because I do it every quarter or so for the ad sales, I do a bit of prospecting. And less so more recently, I've been spoiled with people and incoming requests for people that want to sponsor the show. But I force myself to do it so I can put everything into practice that we talk about in each of these episodes. So we're talking about proactive prospecting. We kick off the show by getting into why salespeople need to prospect proactively and not just rely on things, incoming leads from marketing. Of course, they could just dry up at any point, and you're more valuable to your company if you can bring in leads yourself. Then we dive into the fact that most people are a little bit, I can't remember how Tibor described it in the show, but a little bit soft essentially with how they prospect. People can hide behind emails way easier than sending something in the post, or cold calling obviously still works. We all hate doing it, but it works. And there's a few other things as well. And then to wrap the show up, we get into habits and how important they are. We've covered that before, but for prospecting, I think this is particularly useful, seeing as no one likes doing it. Tibor himself is a 25-year B2B sales veteran. He is a recognized speaker and an award-winning author of his book, Shift, Harness the Trigger Events That Turn Prospects into Customers. He is over at sellbetter.ca. You can find everything that we talk about in the show notes over at salesman.red. And final prompt, if you're not viewing this on YouTube, you don't have to watch them all on YouTube, but it's definitely worth subscribing to the channel. That's over at salesman.red/YouTube. Let's jump into today's episode. Hi, Tibor, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Nice to be here, Will. How are you?
I'm good, sir. I am keen to dive into prospecting with you. And the specific phrase I've picked up from the language that you're using on your website and everything else that you do is proactive prospecting. So, massively loaded question here to start off the show. And I say that, I'm assuming it's a loaded question, but in 2016, the age of the internet, it might not be. Should salespeople, the B2B sales professionals listening to this show, should they be reliant on sales leads being passed to them, or should they be proactively using whatever format, method, structure, which we'll come on to, should they be proactively bringing leads in themselves?
Both. So I think that, with the role of marketing and where some of the automation is and all that today, certainly there is a legitimate expectation that they will get some legitimately qualified leads from marketing. But those should be looked at as a bonus. I think the core of your business, the core of your quota should be leads that you're generating. Those could be from referrals, those can be cold calls, and yes, cold calling still works. I'm sure we'll get into that. But I think that if you're going to be a complete salesperson, prospecting is part of it. I recently did a piece where I talked about the fact that the first sale and probably the most difficult sale you have to make is selling the appointment.
Mhm.
whether you're selling face to face or by telephone or whatever, but it's that initial engagement that needs to be sold by the salesperson. So I think, yes, they need to go after it on their own, but that doesn't mean that they ignore or turn down qualified leads they get from other sources like marketing.
Okay, so we'll come on to the marketing angle, what we're supposed to do with those leads, the value that we put on them, perhaps later in the show. But
Sure.
now I want to strip away, keep your experience, but strip away everything else that you've done in sales. You're new to a sales role. Perhaps it's your first sales role. You've been given nothing other than a laptop, an email address, and a phone. What is the first step of the prospecting process? Going super back to basics. What would you do first, Tibor?
So there's two or three things that I would do simultaneously. So I think which one of those two or three things comes first is going to come down to personal style. One is it goes back, and I don't want to get into detail about some things that we spoke about the first time out, which is really understanding how what I'm selling has impacted customers, because that's going to be the nucleus of it's going to be the nucleus of my talk track or script for the older people in the audience. Um, The second thing that I would do is align that with my goals. So I'm assuming that in addition to the phone, computer, and a desk, I've been given some form of quota, whether that's, dollars that I'm expected to sell or units that I'm expected to move, or with some companies, it comes down to gross profit margin. But there's some number, some carrot has been dangled out there on the distance. And let's say they've convinced me that I can actually grab that carrot with effort. I would work backwards from my goal and figure out how much prospecting I need to do, how much selling I need to do. So I would really look at it from a time perspective. If you look at time as being the currency of sales, and in North America, anyways, there's roughly 1,760 hours in a given year. If you look at that as being currency, how are you going to spend that time? And I mean that literally. How are you going to spend that time? So, how much of that time do you need to spend on prospecting versus all the other aspects of sales? And you can only do that if you work backwards from your goals. So, for round numbers, because I'm a round the guy, if your goal is 1,200,000 a year, you clearly have to bring in 100,000 a year. Let's say your average sale, and you can ask the company or look in the CRM, figure out what the average sale is. Let's say it's 25,000, so you need four sales a month. So now you need to figure out whether you're new or been in the seat for 10 years, what is it going to take for you to to make four sales a month? Because you need that to get to the 100,000 and work backwards from there, to get one close, how many real proposals I have to put out there. And I say real because we all know that at any point in time, we've thrown proposals to the wall just to see if it sticks. So once I know that, then I can figure out, okay, how many people do I have to propose to? And then keep moving backwards. How many people do I have to go through the sales cycle with, to go through a discovery proposal, that whole thing, to get to the number of proposals that I need to do a month? And then how many people do I have to go and engage with to get somebody who's willing to go through the sales process with me? Because I could set an appointment with somebody, and for any number of legitimate reasons, now is not the time that they're going to continue that sales journey with me. They might down the road, but my boss wants me to fulfill quota this month too. So, you know, that would be the second thing that I do is really understand how much of my time and effort is going to be required to prospecting, and then set that time aside, physically go into your calendar. And if, let's say, it's an hour a day, 5 days a week, then put that hour in there, because if you don't, you're not going to live up to it. There's going to be enough challenges thrown your way as a salesperson and somebody doing business these days that it'll put it in your calendar just as you would a client meeting, then it'll take on that real effort, real, what do you call it? Um, it'll be real. There's no more. The third thing that I would do is begin to really understand where my customers are so I can begin to, whether you want to call it accumulate list or begin to put some targets into place. From there we can get real granular. There's a number of tools that I use with prospects of mine or clients of mine to prioritize who you're going to go after first, and a whole number of things that are subsets of that. But the first three things that I would do, again in any order, is again understand why people would want to buy from me. or the company by extension, understand what the numbers are and begin to look for viable sources of leads over and above what I might get from marketing.
Okay, so pretend marketing don't exist for a moment, or pretend we're in a
It's
startup,
easy
for
to do
example.
sometimes.
Well, that's a whole topic and a discussion in itself, Tibor, because I don't think I have, in the medical device roles I've had, I don't think I've ever had a lead that was given to me from a anyone who wasn't a salesperson or a director who was dealing with no decision makers on their terms and on the golf course rather than in the trenches. I don't think I've ever had a lead from marketing or anyone other than them that has actually been worth anything. And obviously, industry specific and dependent, but as I said, that's a whole nother conversation. What I'm intrigued to
Right.
know, and this might be just a super simple answer of ask other people, but what do you do when you don't know how long it's going to take to close a deal? You don't know how many leads you're going to have to put in the funnel to get closes out the other end. Is the only way to go about this to ask other people within the company?
Yeah, if you have that luxury, I mean, if you're working in a company that has, a dozen, couple of dozen, or hundreds of salespeople, that becomes a lot easier. If you're the first or second one in, if you're working in a small company, which probably most salespeople are, I mean, you get rid of some of the big companies, you begin to get into some relatively small sales forces. I think at that point you have to err on the side of abundance. So you say, okay, I don't know how long it's going to take, but I know I'm going to need prospects to find out. So I'm going to overcompensate on the prospecting at the beginning, and then as I start getting engagement, I can begin to balance out. But I don't think that anybody has missed quota by having too many prospects. Is generally the other way around. So I think that if I had no idea, there was truly, I was like, green fields all around, I would err on the side of prospecting and I would probably, 30, 40, 50% of my time in those early days would prospect. As you go out, you become that much smarter and more educated and you can begin to use experience and then you can go back and say, okay, where do I need to tailor this? As you begin to engage with customers, you're going to see whether the sales cycle is longer or shorter than what you anticipated. How aware are the customers and things like that. I heard an interesting thing from the folks at CEB not too long ago that most customers don't have a good notion of how long it'll take them to buy. So in their planning stage, they may think that it's going to take them 9 months to make a buy decision, and it turns out to be a lot longer than that. So if you truly are starting off with a blank canvas, I would overcompensate on the prospecting and review more regularly.
Okay, so we've got our research put together, and I've talked about it on the show before, but my first real sales job, I sat down, the sales new hiring manager behind me, my sales manager, in the same room, and he was just like, "Go on, here's your stuff. Just go and do a bit of research, make some calls, and I'll be in and out of the room." Clearly, he was sat behind me just to hear me on the phone and hear me make those first couple of calls. So I sat down. I very similarly, only by fluke, not by being prepared. I went through a similar process to what you've just outlined then. And then I had to make that first call. And this is where I guess things go from prospecting and the research and the process and all the steps to being proactive with it and pushing the invitation to connect out rather than accepting incoming invitations to talk about the product or service through marketing, through connections, referrals, or whatever it is. Those initial pushes, and we might open a whole can of worms here. Should they be through social? Should you just get on with it, get on the phone, and get some initial conversations going? Again, if you're new to the role, or is there a mix? Is it email? What's the best strategy here, Tibor?
I think it's a mix. I mean, I think that, you should be suspect of anybody, including me, who suggests that there is one method and that's the only method. I always have a laugh when I read articles that have in the title "The Secrets of," like, it's been locked away in an Egyptian vault somewhere and this guy's letting it out. Or when they say cracking the code, what they're cracking the code is how to sell more of the book that they just wrote. So I think it's got to be a mix of all things. I think, again, I'm seeing in the quote unquote telephone cold calling camp, but I'm also recognized for social selling because it's an important tool. Smart salespeople will look and say, which tools are going to help me succeed, right? And that includes social, that includes email, that includes text, telephone. I remember about 6 years ago, I wrote a blog post for somebody, Doyle Slayton. I don't know if you know him, but he had quite a popular blog, and I did a guest post for him where I suggested, this was probably about 2010, that you can prospect using text, mobile SMS.
Mhm.
And people came, I was glad that I wasn't live because I'm sure I would have been lynched. Because it was just, you can't do that, da, da, da. I don't think you can't do anything. As long as it's legal and ethical, I think they should all be part of your prospecting. And that includes, snail mail, email, social media, unsocial media, telephone, telegraph signals, smoke signals, carrier
Okay, with
pigeons,
all that
you
in mind,
name
then,
it,
Tibor,
whatever it takes.
with all that in mind, do you think that salespeople perhaps play it a little bit too safe with how, not quantity, frequency, that kind of thing of the prospecting, but how they are willing to connect with prospects? Because I have sent in my medical device days lumpy mail, as I'd call it, to surgeons. Um, Obviously, there's ethical issues here of not bribing a surgeon who's a decision maker during a tender process to spend money with you. And there's angles to go at all this. But I've sent people stuff in the past in the post, and it's always had a warm reception because and it's not been expensive. It's not even been anything that useful, but it's been different, and so that's caught their attention. And so you've broken through a bit of the noise by doing that. Do you think salespeople play it a bit safe sometimes, perhaps with how they prospect?
Yeah, I think you're being kind when you use the word safe, but yeah, I'll go with it. Um, I think that they play it lazy sometimes. I think that they play it scared sometimes. But I think that they're also, to be fair to them, because it's easy to sit here and snipe, but often they do face the scenario that you suggested, which is, here's your phone, here's your territory, here's your product kit, and here's our price list, and off you go. And we'll probably get there anyway, so I'll jump the gun. But I think that when you talk to salespeople about what they don't like about prospecting or telephone prospecting, more specifically, is the whole notion of rejection, right? It is, you have to be, it's a tough game. I don't want to make it sound like it's easy. I don't like it any more than the next person. But like I always say, I've made the connection between making a cold call and feeding my kids. And, my kids have this thing about eating. So, I got to make the cold call. But, I think what's missing for a lot of salespeople, and this is why, whether it's safe or some other, word that you want to use, is they haven't really been given a process for the prospecting, right? Most companies that you join, even small companies that are not evolved from a sales point of view, will have some form of process. This is where you start. These are the questions you want to ask the customer. These are the quote unquote cues that you look for. Here's what a proposal looks like. Here's some contingency plans in case you run into a roadblock here. Here's some alternative things you might be able to try if you face this situation. So most organizations have either an elaborate or some form of process for what happens from the time that you get a qualified lead, whether you source it yourself or got it from marketing. Those same organizations don't have a process for the prospecting side of it, right? It's that all important element. And there's a number of stats out there that I've pulled together over the last few years that have an interesting picture on this, which is that if you look at on average in B2B North America, so let's keep it here, and
Mhm.
on average, the close ratio on sales qualified leads, so whether you got it from marketing or did it yourself, to actual deals is roughly in the neighborhood of about 16%. It's about 16.5%. So if you look at it differently, the rejection rate's about 83.5%, right? Most of the people who do a formal sales prospecting program, whether it's mine, whether it's other people, I'm not the only one with a good programs. There's a whole host of them out there, will realize a connect, so a conversation to actual engagement, whether it's a face-to-face appointment or a telephone or a web sale or whatever. There's a connection rate of about 14%, or conversely, about an 86% rejection rate. Yet I don't see salespeople flipping out over the fact that they may not get the deal, even though the rejection rate's about the same.
Mm.
And I put the difference off to the fact that there's a process. You can contextualize what happens, if you will. You can rationalize what happened, but there isn't that set of parameters or the set of fences that salespeople can lean on when they're prospecting. And I think that it's not so much that they're playing safe, but every time you get him on the phone, you're asking him to bungee jump, and that's a hard thing to do. But if you gave them some direction, some support, some metrics that they can actually measure these things and put them into context, because again, 83.5% rejection rate, 16%, 86% rejection rate, it's not that different, yet they flip out over picking up the phone and they never complain about going out to a first meeting,
So why is that,
even though
Tibor?
because of a lack of process on the prospecting
No, I
side.
mean, sorry, why is there a lack of process on the prospecting side? To me, so I've never managed salespeople. I've managed a team, as in an assistant, a logistics person. So I have some people managing skills, but I've never managed a sales force by any means. Filling the pipeline through prospecting strikes me immediately as the most important step because, to dumb it down, if you've not got anything at the top of the funnel, you're not going to get anything out of the other end. So why is there a lack of process, a lack of resources being thrown at it, a lack of, from what you're alluding to then, it seems like it's a harder sell to do prospecting training versus things further down the line?
So, I have a couple of opinions on it, as you may have gathered. So, the most cynical level, I think that, you know, salespeople and their managers, it's a lot like a parental relationship, right? So, you do what your father did, you do what your mother did, whatever, right? So, I think that a lot of people see prospecting as a rite of passage, right? And they figure that if they're going out there and they get, relatively good at selling, they could build up a quick book and they don't have to prospect anymore. And I know that sounds bizarre, but I would say on a weekly basis, I've worked with salespeople who've been in their role for 5, 6, 10, 12 years who'll tell me they've earned the right not to prospect. So what does that tell you about their attitude towards prospecting? So I think a lot of them look at it as sort of baptism by fire. And if I get through this and I build up my pipeline and I get some referrals and all that, I could leave this nasty prospecting behind and I don't have to deal with it. And as a result of that, there isn't any tribal knowledge that's built up. If you look at what happens in the sale, there's a lot of tribal knowledge that's built up. There's a lot of, information that's being shared. So I think that if you have a manager who prospected, who's figured it out and put together some form of system or process, you benefit from that because they're going to lead you using that. But I don't think a lot of managers have that. So I think that in many instances, it's easier to deal with stuff that is post prospect than it is pre prospect. And I think a lot of companies just don't give it a lot of thought. I think a lot of sales trainers don't give it a lot of thought. If you look at a lot of sales training methodologies, there's this naive assumption that you've got the prospect, your biggest problem is closing them, right? Which is entirely opposite to the real world, right? Once you have the prospect, I think the bigger problem has been solved. So I think, plainly speaking, I think people just don't focus on it for any number of reasons. One is they don't like it. They can't figure it out. So I can't look bad in front of my team trying to
Mm.
teach and talk about something that I haven't figured out. So I'm going to talk about what you need to do in the first meeting. And, you'll figure out on your own how to get that first meeting. So I really think that, and the other is, again, ever since the telephone's been invented, the battle cry that cold calling is dead has been out there. So everybody figures that, hey, if I ignore it, it'll go away. But we all know zombies don't go away. It's not quite dead. It keeps coming back.
Okay, well,
So
let me turn that on its head slightly then, Tibor.
let's do that.
So, if people who have been in the same role for, say, 5, 10 years, and I find, and the jobs I've been in, after 2 or 3 years, the sales job gets considerably easier because you know your main prospects, you can build on top of business that you've already got in place. You mentioned things like referrals then. So, to turn this conversation on its head slightly, do you really need to be good at prospecting if you can survive that first period? Can you just ignore it once you're 3, 4, 5 years into the role and then just use other methodology or the referrals and things like that to cover your arse, and that brings in enough business in itself.
So I have to answer that with the notion that some prospects might be watching, right?
But
Um,
you can be candid about this, and
no,
it's
I
a
will.
genuine question.
No, I think that they shouldn't be, and I compare it to athletes, right? So whether you look at, football your way or hockey my way, the expectation is that even the best football player, whether it's Messi or, what's his name, the guy up there in Manchester, whatever his name is, Rooney, isn't that his
Yeah.
name? Um, or the hockey players, there's an expectation that they're going to go and practice every day, right? And then they're going to play their 1 or 2 games a week depending on the sport. So why isn't it the same for salespeople? I think what happens is, so to answer your question, I think it needs to be day to day, and the real pros get that. I did some work with a Canadian bank a few years ago, and there was a guy there who's been there for 15 years, and he was one of the biggest advocates of my program. And he had a book that would support him for life. If he never picked up the phone again, his kids would eat plenty. But he would always come to the program and tell the other people that his view is that if he takes the stuff that I teach and puts it into practice and he gets one new client a year, that's a base of 15 referrals over the next couple of years. So by going out and prospecting for one new client in the traditional way, he's able to open up a whole new
Mm.
store, if you will, of other. So, but I think people, look, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not a pleasant thing to do. Nobody likes to be rejected, several times, in a row. But I think it needs to be part of the ongoing, especially because A, you're going to be losing clients. B, things happen. So I think that when you were asking the question, I think what happens is salespeople get sort of lazy, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but when you look off at the start of their career, their trajectory is, fairly high, right? But then they get to a point, they make a couple of 100,000 for 2, 3 years in a row, and they go, hey, this is good. Why should I like work a little bit harder just to get to 300,000, when they could live pretty well at 200,000, right? So I think what happens is people settle. So they say, you know what, I could work really hard and make another 50,000, or I could not prospect and really go out there and work my base and service them and so on and continue to make that 200,000. And if I lose one, maybe marketing will give me a lead, or maybe I'll get a referral, or, maybe sometime next January I'll pick up the phone and get my hands dirty.
So there's two things I'm gathering from this, and I don't really know one from experience, but I know the other one is something that I'm seeing more and more the more of these interviews I do. First off, people becoming lazy from settling it to a certain amount of cash. I've done that in the past. There was a certain amount of cash that I liked having in my bank every year, coming in throughout the months, and there's a set point that I was comfortable with, and I did exactly the same. I got very lazy towards the end of the year. If I'd hit that target to myself, which was always 110, 120% of the general target had been set. So some of the not the blame, that's the wrong word. Some of the responsibility for that has to go to sales management for not incentivizing the sales team correctly. There must be other ways of incentivizing the team other than just money to get them to go to their full potential. So that's one thing. The other side of
Yep.
the conversation is what you talked about, which made me smile when you said it. The difference between a sales pro, a professional, and someone who is just in it, I guess, for a quick buck, or they're in it for an easy ride, they're in it for the cash. A professional in anything, so you mentioned sport then, but whether it's someone who writes, they get up and they write every day, no matter what. If it's, sports, they get up, basketball, they're shooting free throws every single day, even if they are, outstanding their conversion rate on a free throw, they still practice that simple basic procedure. And that's something I'm seeing with salespeople when we've had a couple of VPs of sales to come on the show recently. So we're talking about in the trenches rather than some of the theory side of things. And every single one of
Mhm.
them has the same opinion that the top performers have good sales habits in place rather than leveraging, oh, I'll make some cold calls, I'll get ready and I'll man up and just get on with it. They do their cold calls or whatever it is, the prospecting side of things that they don't particularly like. They do it first thing, they get it over and done with. It's a habit. They do it every day without fail. And so their pipelines are considerably more full than anyone else, and they're not feeling the pain that everyone else feels. So it's win-win for them, and it's putting that habit in place rather than using just willpower alone to get through it.
I think that at the risk of sounding semi sort of contra, it's like a drug, man, like you always need a better fix, So I think that there's some addicts who realize that, I need a bigger fix today than I had yesterday. And I think that, you touched on it earlier. I remember once sharing with one of my managers or directors that I would feel awkward going to a company's annual meeting. They have these sales kickoffs and all that. If I wasn't invited on stage for an award over and above making quota. So you used
Mm.
to get the awards for making quota, and then they would always have, biggest deal, this type of deal, whatever the case might be. And so whenever I was sort of slacking, she would use that on me. She would remind me that if I don't get my act together, I'm not going to be invited up to stage. And I think that you're quite right. I think that people who are motivated to develop those habits and stick with them, just like they would stick with smoking or drinking coffee or any other habits, but this one's a good habit, right? Then, they just fall into that, and it's almost they feel awkward if they're not prospecting, whereas the rest of the population feels awkward when they are prospecting.
Mm-hmm. And
And when you just do it, you run into things.
yeah, and things like rejection. I guess that's and the time it takes to prospect and cold call, because obviously you're unlikely to get the person on the phone the first time. So you're calling, leaving voicemails. There's things to follow up to get you in, so you know where you're at within the CRM system and all that kind of stuff. It's all down to what you tie to it, which is kind of what you were getting at then. Of if you tie your kids eating to making a phone call, that's a very easy task to do, and being rejected does not matter whatsoever. I don't have kids, so it wouldn't be a good example for me. But if I use this in a previous podcast this afternoon, but Nissan GTR here, the car that I aspire to drive eventually, get rid of my Mazda RX-8 and get one of them.
Right.
It's stuck on my wall. So when I have to make a difficult decision, difficult call, whether it's not really happened with what we're doing now with the podcast, but in previous lives in medical device sales, there was lots of previous of painful calls of customers not getting equipment on time, which affects surgery, and I'm the front face of the business, so I have to deal with it, even though it's not my fault. There would always be something stuck to the wall, stuck to my laptop, that I'd look at it, just suck it up, just get on with it, and you're putting a positive spin on the painful situation, and a positive outcome on it, rather than just going, oh, it's Monday, time to make some cold calls, the worst part of my life, and you get miserable, and then you're going to come across miserable to the prospect if you've got that mindset as well. So you're not going to be successful, and then you're just going to have a downward spiral, aren't you?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, as you said earlier, it's a habit. I think that, you don't, I think it helps if you don't come into it with, oh, it's Monday, I got a prospect, but I don't think you have to jump up and down and say, oh, it's Monday, I get the prospect either. I mean, that wouldn't be realistic either. But I think that it goes back to planning and organization, which is a fundamental in any profession, and sales should be a profession. And you look and say, okay, what do I have to accomplish this week? How does that fit into my plan for the month, for the quarter, and then ultimately the year? And, I think the way that I deal with it, and I see a lot of good salespeople deal with it, is you try and figure out how you could do it better. I used to have a friend who played golf every Saturday, every Sunday at the same course. And I used to say, like, what's the point? You've been doing it like 5 or 6 years. And he said, that he plays against himself. His goal is to do better than yesterday. And then on Sunday, the next Saturday to do better than the Sunday before. And then it's a continuous, and it was a very Zen thing and all that. But I think it applies to sales as well.
Definitely, definitely. And with that, Tibor, you've answered some of these before, but I've got a couple of questions I ask everyone that comes on the show. I'm assuming you can't remember what you said last time. Well, we'll see now, but because I'll go back and I'll check this, and I'll make a note of it in the show notes. But the first question I ask everyone that comes on the show is, who is the world's greatest salesperson?
I'll stick with the two I gave you last time, which is Mark Pfeiffer and Dennis Noonan. Although I think Dennis has retired, so it sort of leaves Mark on the throne. But Dennis will get honorable mentions.
Amazing stuff. What is one book or resource other than what you do yourself that you'd recommend to the Salesman Podcast audience?
The 10-day MBA, because it'll help a salesperson begin to develop an understanding of how the person at the other side of the conversation may be viewing the world.
Amazing. That's a new
It's
one on
always
me.
good to speak the other person's language.
Of course, of
I'm
course.
sorry.
And I just think that's a new one on me, so I'll check that out myself. And do you see, a side question to that, do you see salespeople becoming or having to become more and more knowledgeable about business in general and the other processes within a business other than the ability to pitch and ram a pitch down someone's neck, which you probably could have got away with in the past?
I think I'm not sure I agree 100% you could have gotten away with it. I think it was less damaging in the past. But I think now, yes, I think that if you are not understanding and really fitting in and aligning with what the customer is doing, trying to do, we spoke about it at length, I think, on our first conversation in terms of objectives, then you are just left to pitching. And the customers have evolved that far that, pitch is not going to be as effective if it doesn't have some substance behind it.
Okay, cool. What motivates you, Tibor, to close more deals
Other than the kids,
other than the
um,
kids? I imagine that's a pretty big motivator, though.
actually, they're grown up now. One of them could used to lose weight, but that's just a joke. Um, I think, as I said before, I'm fascinated by sales because I think that there's a lot of people who will tell you they think they have it figured out, and that's probably for about 5 minutes, and then, a new element comes along, and it gets you to rethink things. And I think that I enjoy the fact that, people have kindly put me in some sort of expert role, but I would say every morning I wake up trying to figure something out, and just as I figure it out, some other mystery comes along, so I have to bang my head against the desk for a few days. So I think if you're going to continue to be at the top of your game, just like in sports and other things, you cannot rest. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to run around frantically and all that, but you can constantly have to challenge yourself to be a little bit smarter, a little bit, faster, and maybe a little bit more relaxed.
Interesting, more relaxed. Why is that? Because everything else you said is, yeah, I need to be on it. I need to probably experiment. I need to do this, this, and this. But why relax?
Because I think you miss a lot of things when you're tense. I think when you look, if you're a pro, let's assume that, they've followed all the advice we've given on the previous podcasts up until about 30 seconds ago, then you should be a subject matter expert. You should be comfortable with why people buy from you. You should have some relevant examples of where you've been able to help people achieve, business objectives and so on. So at this point you should relax and take it in and really listen to that customer, and in relaxing and taking it in, you're going to respond much better to them, and it's just going to facilitate them being relaxed. And the more relaxed they are with you, the easier it is to establish rapport, the easier it is to listen to them, which, again, is not an easy task, and good things flow from that. So I just find that when I'm relaxed, I do a lot better no matter what the endeavor.
Definitely. Amazing advice. Okay, I've got one question to ask everyone that comes on the show. I'm going to twist it around slightly here, Tibor. If you could
Thanks.
if you could move forward in time and speak to your future self rather than your younger self, from now, what advice would you give your future self to help him become better at sales?
I know what I want to say, but I think this is a family show, right?
No, no, you go for it.
I think the only thing that I would suggest to the future guy is be more open to some things. I tend to have a habit sometimes of, again, because you're rushing and looking at it, and if it doesn't make sense, right away, then I tend to go past it. I'll often revisit things, and because you do run into things over and over, in this age of information, but I think there are some things that it took me a while to stick to, and, in hindsight, had I stuck to them earlier, they might have served me better. So tell that guy to stick to some things, but not overstick. Like at one point, you do have to let go of something if it's not proving itself, but I think you need to give it time to prove itself, which sometimes I don't.
I'm in the same boat, Tibor. I can understand where you're coming from with that. With that said, I want to do a couple of things. I want you to give us your website URL. You mentioned it before. I want you to tell us a little bit, if you can, I guess, tease us on the book that you're preparing. We'll have you back on to talk about it when it's ready. And yeah, tell us where the audience can find out more about you as well.
So they can find out about me at www.sellbetter.ca, sellbetter.ca. Um, and I think the more popular page on that seems to be the blog. I blog twice a week for myself and then for some others. The book, which I keep saying I'm going to write in this year, is the year. I think if people, here's some homework for people if they went back and listened to, I think, our first podcast where I got into quite in depth into the whole notion of objective-based selling and how, if you look at the way the market is segmented, there's a big part of the market that salespeople tend to ignore that's called the status quo. But I'm going to argue, and I'm not alone, but I think I'm taking a slightly different angle on it, is that there's a lot of opportunity in there that is overlooked by some. And if you change your filters and your bearings just a bit, you can pick off that opportunity. And it goes back to our first question of, where do you source your leads and how do you engage those leads? And I think there's a lot of opportunity that people overlook by focusing strictly on pain and needs as opposed to really looking at the entire organization and what the objectives are and how to get them to those objectives.
Mm-hmm. Well, when that is sorted, and
The
there's
rest
going to be
will
some
be
pressure
in the
on now.
book.
There's going to be some pressure on now,
Yes.
especially from our audience, because we'll have you back when the book is ready, no doubt about it. With that, Tibor, I want to thank you for your insights and your time today, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Always fun, Will. Thank you.
And there we have it. Tibor, thank you for joining us on the show. Your knowledge and prospecting and that side of things is second to none. Really appreciate your time, and I always enjoy our conversations. You're pretty funny, a pretty funny guy. Thank you, Sales Nation, for tuning in, as always. And with that, I'll speak with you again tomorrow.